Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for holding. Your lines have been placed on a listen-only mode until the question and answer portion of today's conference. During the question and answer session, you can press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone to ask any questions over the phone lines. Please be sure your phone line is unmuted and state your name at the prompt so we can announce your name prior to you asking your question. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. And I'd like to turn our call over to our first speaker today, Mr. Andrew Haight. Sir, you may begin.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy days to join our webinar today. Again, my name is Andy Haight. I'm an economist here at the U.S. Census Bureau at our headquarters office in Maryland. I'm actually calling to you from home, teleworking. As you all know, we're 100% telework at Census. So if you hear any strange dog barkings or other strange noises, you'll understand that, no, I'm not here at the office. So today's webinar is going to be an update on where we are with the local area data from the 2017 Economic Census. As many of you already know, we started releasing data from the Economic Census in September of last year, but in January we began releasing our local area data. So this webinar today is going to be focusing on the data that we have released so far for Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. This is the third in a 20-part webinar series. The Tuesday webinars will always be geography-based, data for specific states, and the Thursday webinars are going to be for individual sectors. So this Thursday's webinar, the 26th, is a webinar on the transportation and warehousing sector, which, as many of you can probably guess, is a very important one in the United States, not just in general terms, but especially true right now with everything that's been going on in our economy in the last few weeks. So to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about what is the U.S. Census Bureau. By now, every one of us should have received either a letter with a postcard or a letter with the form from the decennial census. However, the decennial census is not the only thing we do at the U.S. Census Bureau. We conduct more than 130 monthly, quarterly, and annual and periodic programs as part of the Census Bureau's mission. Those programs include demographic programs like the decennial census, but it also includes a really fantastic program called the American Community Survey, or the ACS. The ACS replaces what used to be the old decennial census long form and now provides a rich set of demographic, socioeconomic, and even housing data every single year. For those of you who are not already using the data from the American Community Survey, I would highly encourage you all to check it out. It forms the basis of a lot of the research that businesses do to understand their customers. In addition to those demographic programs, though, we conduct 58 business surveys. 2 of them are here on the slide, and that is the Census of Governments and the Economic Census. These 2 programs are conducted every 5 years on the years ending with 2 and 7. So 2017 is our latest Economic Census year. And these 2 programs work hand in hand to measure the private sector and the public sector economy. When we talk about those 58 different programs, I love to use this pyramid as a visualization to understand the hierarchy of these different programs. At the very top of the pyramid is our monthly and quarterly surveys. These are the surveys that you hear about on the evening news, the monthly retail sales report, or the monthly trade imports and exports data report, or some of those other very, very timely economic indicator surveys. 17 of the 22 economic indicator surveys are actually done by the U.S. Census Bureau, and these provide very timely data, but fairly limited in terms of detail. 15 of those 17 surveys only publish data at the national level. 2 of them do provide some more detail. Below the monthly and quarterly surveys are our annual surveys. We conduct 20 different annual surveys that measure nearly every sector of the U.S. economy. They include sector-specific programs like the Annual Survey of Manufacturers, and they also include programs that cover all sectors of the economy, like county business patterns or non-employer statistics. What we're going to spend today talking about is the base of the pyramid, the Economic Census. This is our program that we do every 5 years, as I all mentioned, and it is our most comprehensive and detailed program we conduct at the Census Bureau. When we talk about the Economic Census, there's a number of things that are sort of important points to understand. First of all, it is the most detailed program that we publish in terms of industry breakouts. We publish data for nearly every 2 through 6 digit North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS, codes that we cover at the Census Bureau. There are some exclusions in the Economic Census. The big exclusion is the agriculture sector, which is NAICS 11. That is because the U.S. Department of Agriculture publishes data from the Census of Agriculture. I've also provided here on this slide a link to the other exclusions that we have. And I just want to quickly point out to you all that after our webinar today, not only will the recording and a transcript be provided, but so will the actual presentation itself. So you don't have to frantically write down that URL to understand what else is excluded. For example, that exclusion file excludes colleges and universities because the National Center for Education Statistics publishes detailed data on those types of businesses. The Economic Census is our most detailed program in terms of geography, too. The census provides data not only at the national and state level, but even by metropolitan area, county, and place. Place is our term that we use at the Census Bureau to talk about cities, towns, villages, and boroughs. In the Economic Census perspective, we recognize every incorporated city and unincorporated area, or what we call a census-designated place, that has at least 2,500 people living there or 2,500 people working there. So that 2,500 cutoff is a key cutoff for separate inclusion in the Economic Census. Communities that have fewer than 2,500 people that live or work in that community are counted in the Economic Census. They are just included in something called the balance of county, which is a term that we use in the econ side. The Economic Census is also our most detailed program in terms of other dimensions that we publish at the Census Bureau. I get questions a lot about business size data. Users will ask me, Andy, does Census have data on small businesses? And my answer is yes, we do. But I always then ask them, well, what do you mean by small? Are you talking about small individual businesses, what we call an establishment, or are you talking about small companies, what we call a company or a firm? Are you talking about small as defined by employment size, how many employees the business have, or do you care about small, is your definition of small based upon what their revenues are? The Economic Census publishes detailed data not only by employment size and revenue size, but also by size of the establishment or size of the firm. We even have other detailed dimensions like franchise status. Users often will ask me, Andy, I'm thinking about opening a restaurant, and I've been debating whether or not I want to be a franchise. I want to purchase a franchise for my restaurant or just open Andy's Bar and Grill. What do you think? Does Census have any data that can help me? And in short, yes, we do. The Economic Census does publish data for over 300 detailed industries on franchise status. The Economic Census is also our most detailed program in terms of the data variables that are shown. It includes core statistics like the number of businesses, or what we call establishments, employment, payroll, and some measure of output, whether that is sales, shipments, receipts, or revenue. But we also publish detailed information that is specific to individual sectors of the U.S. economy. For example, in the manufacturing sector, we publish detailed information on inventories, capital expenditures, assets, depreciation, etc. The fifth bullet here is about our product lines data, which is, again, unique to the Economic Census. Product lines measure the individual products or services provided by businesses. So if I was looking at data for the grocery store industry, I could look at total revenue, total sales of grocery stores, but I might be interested in finding out how much canned vegetables do grocery stores sell versus how much chicken do they sell versus how much broccoli do they sell. These detailed product lines are published in our product line statistics. That, again, is one of the key attributes, unique variables that is published in the Economic Census. In terms of where you can go to get data from the Economic Census, for this census, we are releasing all of our data in the Economic Census on our brand new data.census.gov platform. We'll learn a little bit more about that later, but we also are releasing the Economic Census on two other data tools, Census Business Builder and QuickFacts. There are a few others that may have this data as well. Now, at the very bottom of this slide, I've included a note about data that we publish at the Census Bureau based upon the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner. Historically, we have published a survey called the Survey of Business Owners that was conducted on the same years as we do the Economic Census that measures that detailed data on business ownership. Last couple years ago, we added a brand new survey called the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs. ASE is supplemented annually the data that was published every 5 years as part of the Survey of Business Owners, or SBO. Starting in the spring, we will be releasing brand new data in a brand new survey called the Annual Business Survey, or ABS. ABS will replace both SBO and ASE and will publish similar statistics on the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner, as well as a lot of other detailed data. Now, as you can probably tell, this Economic Census is so comprehensive that it takes us a while to get all the data released. What you're seeing on your slide right now is a screenshot of our release schedule, our calendar, that shows when are all the data from the Economic Census coming out. In September of last year, we released something called the First Look Report at the very top of this chart on the left-hand side. The First Look provided national level estimates for every 2 through 6 digit industry that we publish in the Economic Census. The data are preliminary. These national level numbers will be superseded when we release the national level numbers at the end of the local area data releases, the geographic area statistics, which is over on the left-hand side as well. Geographic area data started coming out in January and will complete by November of 2020 of this year. I have it on good authority, though, that we are likely to complete that data much earlier. At the bottom of the slide, I have provided a link to this release schedule, so if you want to kind of look at this in a little bit more detail, you can. Now, as we are flowing out that data from the Geographic Area Series, one of the things that users often ask us is, why do you flow it out the way you do? And what is that flow? Users have historically said, it looks like you start on the West Coast and on the East Coast and slowly work your way toward the center of the nation. Why is that? And this is mostly a function of metropolitan areas. It's easier for us to publish data for states who have metropolitan areas that are fully enclosed within that state, because if you think about the ability for us to publish data for that metropolitan area, when we publish the metro area, we publish not only the metro as a total, but also all of the counties that make up that metropolitan area. For metropolitan areas that are totally within a particular state, we can publish all those counties and that metro area as a total in one package. But for metropolitan areas that straddle state boundaries, it makes it harder because we have to review the data for all those neighboring states at the same time as when we release the data for the metropolitan area as a whole. Now, to help users understand this flow of these data, we have a Geographic Area Series release resource page on our Economic Census website. At the top left of the slide, you can see the URL to that release schedule. When you go to this release schedule page, you will see 3 pieces of information. At the very top, you'll see an Excel file of what has been released. We update this Excel file every Monday, and that file reflects all of the data that have been released through that date. Below that, at the bottom of the page, we have a link to an Excel file that provides information on what's coming in the next 30 days. So if the data that you care about for the state or the sector that you're interested in are not yet released, you can check this upcoming releases file to see, is it scheduled for release in the next 30 days. In between those two resources is the graphic that's over on the right-hand side of the slide. This graphic, this state visualization, allows users to go in and graphically see what states and what sectors have been released. When a state has a peach fill in it, that means that we have started releasing data for that state. Once that state is completely finished, all the data released, the entire state will then be filled in that peach color. So you can see we've got a lot of the West Coast states, Alaska and Hawaii, and we've been working also on the East Coast states as well. In this visualization, there are a couple of really nice features. In the bottom right-hand corner is a donut chart that shows us the percentage of the data that have been released as of the date of this visualization. My slide's a little bit old. This is as of March 12th. So as of March 12th, we had released 38% of all of the data that's released as part of the Geographic Area Series. At the very top of the slide of the visualization, though, there's a menu. And in that menu, I can choose a particular sector of the U.S. economy. So let's say I'm interested in the healthcare sector. I could choose healthcare from that menu at the very top, and then the map would repaint, and it would allow me to see what are all the states that we have released healthcare data for yet. In providing those lists of states that have released data, when you click on a particular state, you get a link first that shows all of the sectors that have been released for that state. So for example, if I were to click on Alaska on this graphic, I would see that 14 of the 18 economic census sectors have been released. In that list of released sectors, I could then click on one of those links and it would actually bring me straight into data.census.gov, right to the data for that sector and for that state. So I'm really encouraging you all to check out this release visualization, bookmark it, and periodically come back to it because it gives you a really nice shortcut to get into our brand new data.census.gov platform. At the very bottom of the slide, I just wanted to mention that the data for Alaska and Montana was actually some of our first states that we started releasing in January. Those data started coming out on January 16th. The other states that we're talking about today, Idaho, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming, all started on January 23rd. So you can see we've been making pretty good progress on these states. Now, when we talk about the economic census, one of the things that we like to talk about is the key changes that you're going to see in the economic census. Because this is our baseline and benchmark survey, we implement a lot of changes in the economic census that are then reflected in the monthly, quarterly, and annual programs that occur after the economic census. For example, the boundaries of geographies change all the time. Some of us may not be aware of this, but even counties can change from year to year. Places change all the time. Metropolitan areas also change. And of course, zip codes are at the whim of the United States Postal Service. They change even on a monthly basis. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to be talking about some of those geographic area changes that you're going to see in looking at the data from the 2017 economic census for these states that we're going to talk about today. I want to bring this up about geography change. It's a very important concept, not only for users of Census Bureau business data, but users of other business data as well. Often I will talk with a user who is comparing data for their local economy over the last 5 or 10 years. And they're saying, you know, Andy, the data is showing that there's this really big increase in this particular city, and it just doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem like we really have grown as much as this data might indicate. Well, if you then looked at the change notes for that geography, you might then discover that the boundaries of that city actually grew. The city annexed some neighboring land. And maybe some amount of the growth of that city over those last 5 or 10 years was due to the annexation, not due to actually real economic growth. So anytime you're doing time series comparisons of business data, and again, I'm going to stress this not only for the Census Bureau's business data, but for business data in general, we always recommend you check to make sure that the thing you are comparing is in fact comparable. And one of the things that you want to check on is that it is geographically comparable. Now, in addition to geographic area changes, we also make changes to the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS system, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about this new NAPS system, the North American Product Classification System, and some of the other changes that you're going to be seeing. So let's start off with those geography changes. And there's going to be a couple of slides here, one for each state. I would encourage you all who are interested in a particular state, when you get this Excel file, or excuse me, this PowerPoint file, to go ahead and download it, print off this particular page, and keep it to the side. So for the state of Alaska, there were no metropolitan area changes from 2012 to 2017 economic census. That means that I can compare the data for the Anchorage metropolitan area between 2012 and 2017 and know that that data are completely and totally comparable. However, there are 55 economic places that had some type of change. 25 of them had area gain, 25 of them lost some area, 2 of them had a name change, and there were 2 brand new places that we recognized for the first time in the 2017 economic census. They are over on the right-hand side. They include Fairbanks North Star Borough and Valdez Cordova Census Area. Those 2 areas are brand new places. Esther CDP and Cordova City are 2 brand new places that we are recognizing for the first time in the 2017 economic census. Normally, the reason why we recognize a brand new place is because the population of that area has grown to the point that it now meets that 2,500 minimum criteria that I mentioned earlier. And finally, there were no dropped places. There were no places in Alaska that had qualified for the 2012 economic census and now don't qualify in the 2017. At the very top right of this slide and all of the other slides we'll be talking about in the next couple of slides, I provided a link to our geographies page where you can go in and not just see these high-level totals, 55 places with area gain, but you can actually go in and actually see which places by name had area gain. A lot of times users assume the only places that are gaining or losing area are small geographies. That certainly is not true at all. For example, the city of Anchorage actually gained area between 2012 and 2017, and the city of Barrow, Alaska, lost area. At the bottom of the slide is a link to our Tiger Web Econ resource. This is a web-based interface that allows you to not only learn about these changes from a list perspective, but actually see those changes on a map. For example, the town that I live in had a boundary change from the last economic census. That boundary change annexed some land that is adjacent to the town that I live in. In that land that they annexed, all that exists there, the only things that were on that land when they annexed it were businesses. There were 27 businesses that were in that area that have been in that area for quite some time, but were not considered part of the town that I live in. There were no houses, though, in that area. So by looking at the Tiger Web Econ, I could see what is that piece of land that now constitutes the barrier and the boundary change. And that means I can now go in and say, well, I know that there were businesses that were there, but there's no people. So that means that that boundary change is important when you think about the business data, the economic data for my town, but it's not important from a demographic perspective because that boundary change had no impact on the demographics of Crofton, Maryland. So Let's talk a little bit about Idaho. Just like with Alaska, we had no metropolitan area changes, but 103 economic place changes, 54 with gain, 47 with area loss. One place that had a name change, Boundary County, actually had a name change. One brand new place, the city of Bellevue, and again, no dropped places. Over on the right-hand side is a small screenshot of a piece of the GeoNotes file for the state of Idaho, so you can go in and actually see what were those areas that had a change. So American Falls City at the very top had area loss. Right underneath it, Ammon City had area gain. Bellevue City is that third line that was a new economic place. These types of resources, these GeoNotes files, are all available on that geographies page that's in the upper right-hand corner. Looking at the state of Montana, once again, there were no metropolitan area changes, but 97 of the economic places in Montana had some type of boundary change. 46 places had area gain, 46 with area loss. No places had a name change, or brand new places, and no dropped places. So looking over on the right-hand side, we can see a little piece of our GeoNotes files that lists what are those 4 added places. You'll notice that Big Sky CDP and Pablo CDP were added. Those blue highlighted ones mean that the city of Blue Sky, that particular census designated place, actually straddles both Gallatin County and Madison County. So we've added a geography that actually is in multiple counties in that state. Okay. For Oregon, again, no metropolitan area changes, but 137 economic place changes, 79 with area gain, 50 with area loss, no places with a name change, 7 new places, and 2 dropped places. On the right-hand side, we can see what are those 7 new places that were qualified. Now, again, to the point I was making before about changes to geography are not just for small towns. The city of Portland actually had area gain, and the city of Astoria, Oregon, had area loss. For the state of Utah, once again, there were no metropolitan area changes, but you can see the following list of types of other changes that did occur, 152 economic place changes in total. The city of Salt Lake City actually gained area, and the city of Provo, Utah, lost area between 12 and 2017. Last couple of states I want to talk about. For Washington State, again, there were no metropolitan area changes, but 277 economic place changes, 156 places that had area gain, 112 that lost area, and you can see the other statistics here. So again, I just want to reiterate that understanding these geography changes is really important when you're then comparing data over time, because you want to make sure that the data, in fact, you're using is comparable. That geography page that I have a link to in the upper right-hand corner gives you these details more than what I'm just showing here on the slide. And what I always tell people is print these things off and have them when you're using data from other resources, so you can make sure that the comparison you're about ready to make with that other data, even third-party data, is in fact comparable. The city of Seattle, Washington, had area gain, and Tacoma, Washington, was one of those cities that had area loss. And finally, we'll finish off with Wyoming. Wyoming, once again, had no metropolitan area changes, 31 economic places that changed. There were 15 places that had area gain, 15 that lost area, no places that had a name change, a single new place, and I'm really sort of intrigued by this, called Bar None. I really want to understand where is Bar None and go visit that maybe someday, and no dropped places. Over on the right-hand side, again, I've got a little screenshot, just a piece of the data available for this particular state. Okay. Sorry about that. Let me just hide this here. Okay. So let's now talk about the NAICS changes, the North American Industry Classification System changes that we're making in the 2017 Economic Census. NAICS is the classification system that we use to classify every business in the Economic Census. Every single business establishment gets its own single 6-digit NAICS code that identifies the primary activity or is based upon the primary activity of that particular business. NAICS is a 3-country agreement. It was developed by the Office of Management and Budget here in the United States, but it also has participants from Statistics Canada and the Mexico Statistical Agency, INEGI. Having a single consistent classification system helps users compare data across those 3 North American countries. It was adopted in 1997, and it does get updated every 5 years. 2017 is our latest update. We do the NAICS updates on the same year as we do the Economic Census. So the Economic Census is one of those first programs that we release that has detailed data on the new NAICS basis. Now, when we make changes, when there are changes made to the NAICS classification system, those changes can be grouped into a number of categories. There are simple recodes where we take one code in 2012 and it becomes a different code in 2017, but where there was no content change. On the following few slides, you'll see these highlighted in blue. There are many-to-one, or what we call combos, where 2 or more NAICS codes in 2012 were combined into a single NAICS code in 2017. And then finally, there are many-to-many, which are shown in sort of a peach color on the next few slides, where pieces of NAICS industries were pulled out of one industry and moved to another to better align with the actual activity that's occurring in the United States. Splitters are cases where we take a single NAICS code in one year and split it into 2 or more NAICS codes in this year. There were none for the 2017 NAICS system, but there were a couple in the 2012 NAICS system, including a brand new industry for solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass electric power generation. These slides now talk about the NAICS changes themselves. So you can see that there are 3 sectors listed here. The mining sector, the manufacturing sector, and the retail trade sector all had NAICS changes for 2017. Just like those geography changes we were talking about, it's important to understand how NAICS is changing when you're looking at the local area data, because sometimes those NAICS codes may disappear or may have changed, and you may think that there's certain change occurred when in fact it really was more a figment of the NAICS change. So for example, over on the right-hand side, you can see that we have this grouping of 4 industries for household cooking appliance, household refrigerator, household laundry equipment, and other major household appliance manufacturers. Those 4 industries existed in the 2012 NAICS system, and they have now all been combined into a single NAICS code for major household appliance manufacturers in 2017. So if I was looking at data for 2012 and I wanted to see how has this industry changed between 2012 and 2017, I would no longer be able to find the data for those 4 separate codes. I would have to add those 4 codes together to create the new total for major household appliance manufacturers. Similarly, for the retail trade sector, we used to publish detailed data specifically for electronic shopping, electronic auctions, and mail order houses, but because of consolidation that has occurred in those 3 industries between 2012 and 2017, we now have a single 6-digit NAICS code, 454110, for electronic shopping and mail order houses. Now, these couple of slides here, this slide and the next one, give you some high-level looks at what these NAICS changes are. I would encourage you all to check out the NAICS website to learn more information, and I've provided that link here on the bottom right of the slide. This NAICS website is nice to not only understand the changes for the 2017 Economic Census, but you could also look as far back as the 1997 Economic Census when NAICS was first born. And this is a place that you can also go to check out the proposed changes for the NAICS 2022. So as you can imagine, because it's a three-country agreement, the three countries have to work together for quite some time to come up with revisions to the classification system. These are the last slides on these changes. The information sector, real estate rental and leasing, and the professional, scientific, and technical services sectors all had changes. In professional, scientific, and technical services, this is where we have the only truly brand new industry for research and development in nanotechnology. That industry has now matured to such a point, to such an extent here in the United States, that it now warrants having its own NAICS code, and the data now will be shown that way. Now for real estate and rental and leasing, you can see all of those industries are these one-to-ones. So if I was interested in finding out just how many videotape and disc rental places are there left in the United States, I'm actually quite intrigued to find out that there's any left in the United States. The NAICS code that we had in 2012, 532230, that code has now changed and is now 532282. So often these recodes happen to better group those industries together into a particular grouping, but they've had no content change. So all of these blue highlighted industries are ones where the data is completely comparable between 2012 and 2017, even though the code has actually changed. Now, we just talked a few minutes ago about where can you go to get all of these data. Data.census.gov, of course, is the primary place that you want to go for the economic census data. This is our brand new data dissemination platform that is replacing American FactFinder. American FactFinder will be sunsetted in less than a week. For those of you who are freaking out a little when you hear that, I would encourage you all to go in and check out data.census.gov, check out some of the training materials that we have available, and get used to using it, because this is where you're going to have to go to get these data. The economic census data are also released on our most popular tool at the Census Bureau, QuickFacts. QuickFacts lives right in the middle of the main Census Bureau homepage, and its key feature is it allows you to go in and find demographic and business data for a specific geography. You can go in and choose up to 7 different geographies and compare, for example, the nation to a state, to a county, to a city, and even to a zip code. And finally, the third tool I want to quickly mention where you can go to get data from the 2017 Economic Census is Census Business Builder version 3.0. We will be releasing the data from the 2017 Economic Census in the 3.1 release of Census Business Builder, which is scheduled for release in August of this year. We were going to include these national level numbers right away, but we decided to hold off and to wait until the data were complete before we put them into Census Business Builder. Now, as we are releasing these data, we also want to promote them via social media. So we have been creating these nice little fun facts that provide a little tiny snippet of information about a given state and about a given sector. So these are 3 of the fun facts that we have released so far for Oregon, Utah, and the state of Washington. You can see we have used the 50-state quarter that was done for each of those states as part of this, this visualization. I love them, and I would really encourage you all to tweet them and to send them out to your friends, etc. Bottom of the slide, I have a link to the visualizations page where all of these visualizations that have been released are sitting. Right now we have 26 of them released so far, including these 3. We will have 56 of them by the time we are completely finished with the economic census local area data. And finally, on this slide, I want to mention that we write stories in something called America Counts. America Counts is a website that provides stories about Census Bureau data, and I actually wrote a nice little story about these fun facts and about how the economic census measures our changing economy in this particular site, and I provided a link to that story here on the slide. Now, I want to quickly highlight some data, since I'm sure you all are curious about the data that are available for these particular states. I have one slide for each state here, Now, you will notice that there are a couple of slides, a couple of bars where there's an NA. We don't publish state-level data for 3 different sectors: utilities, information, and the financial insurance sectors. So those are the 3 where the revenue bar is NA. But you can see that in the state of Alaska, the retail trade sector actually has the highest sales of any of the sectors that we have released so far. Now, I will tell you, we have not yet released the data for mining, for construction, for manufacturing, or for management of companies and enterprises. Those 4 sectors will all be released together in August. But I suspect that retail trade will probably continue to be the largest sector in Alaska's economy when it comes to sales. However, when you look over at the right-hand side, you can see a pattern that is very common across many states, and that is the boom in revenue in the healthcare sector. That sector by far has had the largest increase, an increased change of $1.5 billion between 2012 and 2017. The one bar that is actually negative is actually the wholesale trade sector. So while that sector is a very high sector, looking at that left chart, in terms of total sales, that number is actually down quite a bit from the 2012 Economic Census. Looking at some data for Idaho, you can see, again, wholesale trade is one of those really high sectors. And wholesale trade has also had the largest increase in their sales from 2012 to 2017. Again, I want to remind you all that some of these sectors haven't been released yet, and some of them are not available. But of the ones we have published, you can clearly see how much the wholesale sector in Idaho has grown. Looking at the state of Montana, we see a similar pattern of wholesale trade and retail trade really being the dominant sectors in that state. But once again, looking at change between 2012 and 2017, we can see that the healthcare and social assistance sector has seen the largest increase. Now, in each of these slides, we are looking at data for sales, but I also mentioned that the Economic Census publishes data on numbers of businesses, employment, payroll, and a wide variety of other statistics. I picked on revenue as our key statistic to show here because it's one of the statistics that is unique to the Economic Census, publishing this comprehensive data, but you could also look at the other statistics as well. And I also want to point out that while we are looking at data just for the state as a whole, these same types of statistics are available at those lower levels of geography as well: metropolitan areas, counties, places, etc. Now, some of the sectors, we only publish data at the state and metro level, not the full hierarchy because of privacy. So, for example, when you think about the numbers of utilities companies in the United States, it's the smallest sector in the U.S. economy, but that sector we only publish data at the national and state and metro level, not the full detail because there'll be so many suppressions. For the county that I live in, for example, there's only one utility company in that particular county. Switching gears to Oregon, once again, we can see wholesale trade being our largest sector in the state of Oregon of the published sectors, but we can really see how much the retail trade sector has boomed in Oregon between 2012 and 2017, increasing about $12.2 billion in that 5-year period. So that sector is ranked second in terms of total sales, but boy, has it really growing even faster than the healthcare sector is growing. In Utah, we see a similar pattern of wholesale and retail really dominating, but unlike Oregon, in Utah, we see wholesale and retail also are the sectors that had the largest increases in sales between 2012 and 2017. We don't see that same sort of increase for the healthcare and social assistance sector, although the number, it did increase a good amount. It's just not quite to the point that of the wholesale and retail. For the state of Washington, again, a similar pattern of wholesale and retail really dominating, but again, like some other states, retail trade really is doing quite well in the state of Washington, showing the largest gain between 2012 and 2017. And finally, for the state of of Wyoming. We see retail trade being slightly larger than the wholesale trade sector in terms of total sales. But again, we see wholesale being up, but retail sales actually being down quite a bit between 2012 and 2017. The healthcare and social assistance sector is that sector that has had the largest increase in revenue. Healthcare has become one of our largest sectors in the United States. It is the largest employer sector in 32 of our 50 states, and it's actually ranked number 2 in another 10 sectors, in another 10 states. So this is a very, very important sector in the U.S. economy, something we are certainly hearing an awful lot about on the news in the last few days and weeks. So let's now change gears and just close us out today to talk about what's coming next. I mentioned at the very start of the presentation today that one of the data products we release as part of the Economic Census is something called product lines. Product lines provides a breakout of the different products and services made or sold by businesses in the United States. In the 2012 Economic Census, the data that we published on product lines for the manufacturing and mining sectors, the construction sector, and all other sectors were released completely separately in 3 very different looking tables. So if I was a user and I was interested in looking at shoe manufacturers and the sales of amount of shoes made by companies in the United States, shoe wholesalers, shoe stores, and shoe repair facilities, if I cared about looking at the entire supply chain of shoes, I would have to look at 4 different tables to find the information for those types of businesses and the products that they make or sell. Under the North American Product Classification System, or NAPS, you will now be able to look at that product line data in one consolidated set of tables that are all done in a consistent manner that will allow users to pull the data together. In the bottom right-hand corner, I have included the URL for the NAPS website. I would encourage you all to check out this website. The NAPS data will be coming out in November of this year, but I would encourage you all to check out that website to get a preview of what is going to be coming from this NAPS website, from these NAPS data, so you know how to compare them to the 2012 and prior product lines data. The second thing that we are releasing after NAPS is then our establishment and firm size reports. These are scheduled for release between November of 2020 and September of 2021. It's quite a long period of time. And the major change there is that we are consolidating all of those different establishment and firm size tables into 7 consolidated tables. In 2012, we released separate tables for each individual sector. So if I was interested in small manufacturers, small retailers, and small healthcare providers, I would have had to go to 3 different tables to get the data for those 3 different sectors. Now we are going to be combining all of the data for those sectors into consolidated tables. So all of the employment size of the establishments tables are going to be consolidated into one big consolidated table. That will make it much easier for people to be able to pull data by business size across the different sectors. And finally, the last set of data that we release as part of the Economic Census is the miscellaneous subjects tables. We are going to be dropping some tables this time due to low response and a few other reasons, but there are a couple of brand new tables. And again, I would encourage you to check out our Economic Census website to learn more about these. Now, way at the beginning of the presentation, you might have seen a note about zip code level data from the Economic Census, and a note that we aren't publishing zip code level data. I've had some users that have said, oh my goodness, Andy, zip codes, I love them. They're the smallest geographies you guys publish in Econ. Why are you not publishing zip code data for the Economic Census? And my answer is you don't need to fuss. We actually publish just as good, if you will say, just as much detailed zip code data from Zip Code Business Patterns, our Zip Code Business Patterns program, and those data are available every year, not just every 5 years. So losing the zip code data from the Economic Census really isn't a big deal because you have that data available from Zip Code Business Patterns. So to summarize, The Economic Census provides an amazing wealth of business data. Even after more than 30 years at the Census Bureau, I still am astounded by the types of information that we publish in the Economic Census and how businesses and others can use that data. To learn more about this incredible wealth of data, I would encourage you all to check out our Economic Census website. Because we release so much data, the data are released on this flow basis. We've spent a good part of the webinar today talking about that flow when it is how it compares to the geographic area statistics. All states and sectors should be completed by around August of this year, but then there's more data coming after that. Again, I would encourage you all to check out our Economic Census website and specifically the news releases page to find out information about that flow of data, to find out when is the sector and state that you care about going to be released. I really would encourage you all to check out our geographies page to learn about those geographic changes so that when you are comparing data, whether it's from the Census Bureau or from another source, that you are in fact making good, honest comparisons between geographies over time. And similarly, I would encourage you all to check out the NAICS website to learn more about the North American Industry Classification System for 2017 and about those changes. Finally, last couple of points is that data are now being released on data.census.gov. I would encourage you all to go there and check out that site. There's a lot of great training materials that my colleagues have actually started working on, but more data is coming. So with this, I would now like to start opening the questions up for Q&A. My colleague, Linda Lee, is standing by to take any questions that come in via the chat. And then after we do that, we will then go ahead and take any questions over the phone. So operator, if you want to say a few things about questions, that would be great.
Absolutely. At this time, if you would like to ask any questions over the phone lines, please press star, then 1 on your phone's keypad. Be sure your phone line is unmuted and state your name at the prompt so we can announce your name prior to you asking your question. Again, that is star, then 1 on your phone's keypad to ask any questions over the phone lines.
So while we wait for you all to queue up your phones on the phone, Linda, do we have any questions that came in via chat?
Hi, Andy. Yes, at this moment we have 3 questions in the queue via the chat feature. And our first question is, how does the data compare with the information from the Yellow Book, and what are the similarities and differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I get a lot of questions that compare Census Bureau data to other data, whether those are other government data like Bureau of Labor Statistics data or whether that's other third-party data like Yellow Book data. And what I usually say is there's a couple of key differences. First, sometimes our data are more current than the other data, and sometimes those other data sources are more current. So for example, I could go into Bing or Yelp or Google right now to find out how many restaurants are there in Crofton, Maryland, and I would get a list of all of the restaurants that are available there, and that list would be a fairly current list. The latest data we were talking about right now from the Economic Census is from 2017, so sometimes these third-party data sources are more current than the Census Bureau's data are, and sometimes it's the opposite. So I would encourage people to use both. A second big difference that people will see when they're comparing data across different providers is how those data are processed and supplied to the data provider. The Census Bureau, most of the economic programs that we conduct are done on a survey basis where we actually send out forms to businesses. When they complete their form, our analysts review their data, and often our analysts have to contact the respondent to clarify answers that they gave that may not sound quite right. So for example, if I was the analyst looking at data for the convenience store industry, and I knew that in this particular industry, the average payroll per employee of an employee in this particular business is $22,000 a year, if I saw a business responding to me that they were paying their employees $220,000 a year, I would probably call them to find out, did you maybe add an extra zero to the payroll number to come up with that number? So we do a lot of analysis of the data, and some of those other data providers out there don't do that kind of analysis. So you're essentially looking at self-reported data that may be perfect or it might not be. And then the last difference that I often point out when people ask me about comparing that data is the Census Bureau is committed to protecting the privacy of businesses who respond to our surveys. Title 13 and Title 26 of the U.S. Code prevent Census Bureau employees from publishing data that would disclose the identity of individual companies. So, for example, let's say Linda and I owned the only 2 gas stations in our little town. The Census Bureau would not be able to publish data for gas stations because Linda could easily subtract her employment and her payroll and her sales from the published total and know exactly what I pay my employees and how many employees I have. That would be a clear violation of my privacy. Many of these other third-party data providers do not have those same types of privacy protections. So users often say, Andy, it's kind of a bummer that I can't see individual responses, individual businesses by name in the economic census. And what I often tell people is use our data to understand the total for a particular industry and a particular geography, and then use that third-party data to understand the details. Again, read the fine print, make sure you know what they do and how they process that data before you do that. But merging our data with theirs can be very, very helpful. So great question.
Okay, and our next question is, are marijuana industry data collected or planned to be collected?
So it's another great question. Short answer is yes, they are already collected. The longer answer is they do not have their own separate NAICS code. So there is no way to be able to separately identify from these industries where the data are currently being collected and published. There's no way of separating out how much of that data is specifically for cannabis-related businesses versus other types of businesses. So for example, most cannabis retailers are classified in the same NAICS code as things like GNC or other nutrition centers, these supplement type stores. That's the same NAICS code that they use. So there isn't a separate code for them. I know that there has been some discussion in the NAICS committee to see about eventually splitting out cannabis-related industries to give them their own particular industry code. I suspect that one of the things that's going to have to happen for that to happen is for this industry to grow to a large enough extent that it's not only clustered in certain states, but that it's across the entire nation as a whole. Because for our ability to publish data for the nation, if that activity is not legal in certain states, then we wouldn't be able to publish that data for it. So, yeah, great question.
Andy, at this time, I have been notified that we have several calls in the queue, and we should probably go on to the questions from the phone line.
Okay, sounds very good, Linda. Again, you all see my email address and phone number here on the screen, so whatever questions we can't get to via the chat, please feel free to contact me, and we'll answer them later. So, operator, we're ready to take the phone calls.
Absolutely. First question, your line is open.
Yes, hi. First of all, thank you very much. Great job, Andy and staff. My question really is the difference between zip codes and census tracts. Are you doing anything with either or both of them? I know you're doing zip codes.
Right. So in the economic programs area at Census, the farthest we go down to is is zip codes. We do not publish any data below the zip code level, which would include census tract level data. And as you can probably guess, the single biggest reason is privacy. When you start slicing and dicing 8 million employer businesses in the United States down to detailed industries and then try to slice and dice it down to individual census tracts, the probability of having a tract that has only one business of a certain type in that tract would mean that we couldn't publish data for that tract for that industry. So we don't even try Zip codes is the most detailed we go. It is an interesting point, though, because often census tracts are geographically larger than zip codes. So sometimes zip codes are actually a smaller level of geography than a census tract is. That's especially true in rural America, but even true in some other areas. So I always tell people, look at those census tract boundaries and then look at the U.S. Postal Service zip code boundaries, and it may be that the zip code level data may meet your needs, even though you may think you might need tract level data. So yeah, great question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And your next question, your line is open.
Yes, hi there. I thank you very much for hosting these. I was particularly interested in the new annual business survey that Census is implementing. First, I wanted to confirm what I think, which is that there was in fact no 2017 survey of business owners and no survey of entrepreneurs after 2016. That those are the 2012 and the 2016 were the last ones. Those will ever happen. And then, if that's true, when can we expect the first release of data from the new survey of American Survey annual survey of business?
So I will confirm that the 2012 SBO and the 2016 ASE are in fact the latest versions of those two data sets. The first release from ABS is scheduled for this spring. I have it on authority that it might come as early as April. With some of our challenges that we're experiencing here in the DC area with the federal government being 100% telework, that might be delayed a little bit, but I would check back on the ABS website to find out more information about when that data are coming out. What is also being worked on right now is in deciding exactly what levels of detail are going to be published in the ABS versus in the previous SBO and ASE. SBO used to publish data down to place, down to individual cities and towns, whereas ASE was only shown annually down to the state level. In replacing both SBO and ASE, ABS will probably similarly have a mixture of geographies that are published more detailed every 5 years and less detailed on the years in between. But again, I would definitely check out that ABS website. They're going to have a lot of great information. I get a lot of questions about that program.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Your next question, your line is open.
Hello, Andy. Thanks for hosting me. I'd like to ask, compared to coming out of past recessions, is the wholesale and retail trade on a similar course percentage-wise as with Americans' incomes on their salaries and wages stagnating? Are the percentages similar to past recessions coming out of them, or have the percentage fallen in the growth of the retail and wholesale sectors, especially with the wages and income stagnating of Americans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Probably a little bit much for me to do to give you a good, thorough answer as an economist on the phone. What I'd suggest is to maybe send me an email with your question to the email address here on the screen, and then we can kind of go through it that way. What I will definitely tell you is when you look at the growth in the retail industry, which of course is a industry whose customers are the general public, the growth in that industry is much more tied to individuals' personal income and what their spending power is than the wholesale sector is. Wholesalers, by definition, are an intermediary in between the manufacturer or even in some cases the importer and the final retailer. So the movement of their goods has a very different sort of flow. So often wholesale trade is less impacted by things like income change than the retail sector is. But we can definitely talk about this some more in more detail.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And your next question, your line is open.
Hi. When the not available is expressed on the charts, does this mean the data is incomplete or that the statistics are unavailable or possibly under a different sector? What would that sector be? Example 4.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So you're talking about when we were looking at those different bar charts for each state, I had mentioned that data for the utilities sector, for finance, and there was a third one. I'm having a brain cramp right now. What the third one was, that the data are not available.
Yeah, it was like minerals, and that would be kind of fall into well water.
Right. So for the utility sector and for the finance sector, the single biggest reason why revenue data are not available, well, let's pick on finance first. The reason why the revenue data are not available at state level below is because when you think about the typical finance companies, let's pick on banks specifically. The bank's revenue, the employment and the payroll of bank workers is easily associated with the individual branches or offices that those workers work in. So the ability for us to publish local area data on the number of bank branches, the number of bank employees, and the number of banking payroll of those employees is really easy because those workers are actually working at a single physical location, so we can actually tabulate the data. But when you think about the revenue of banking, and this is also true in a way for the other sectors, it's very hard to tag, if you will, to associate the revenue of that business with a specific geography, with a specific location, because that bank's revenue may be generated from things that cannot be associated with a particular thing. So I'll give you a specific example. If you go to your local bank and you take out a small business loan at that local bank branch for your small business, should the revenue that comes to that bank from the sale of that loan to you, should it all be associated with that one particular branch, or should it be more associated with the larger bank? Because when you start paying that loan back, you're going to be paying it back to the bank, not to that specific branch location. So we don't actually publish the detailed data on revenues by that geography, because associating that geography, that revenue with a specific geographic area is it's impossible. It's not that the activity is published somewhere else. It's just that we don't tabulate the data, that revenue data for that level of geography. The data are published nationally. They're just not published at the lower level of geography. That's a complicated answer, but does that make sense?
Yeah, so what would be the national geography site to look up how many gallons of water are being pumped through certain sectors?
Right. So specifically for water consumption, there's actually another source of information that I can refer you to. Go ahead and, if you can send me an email to my email address that's here on the slide, andrew.w.haight@census.gov, I'll actually put you in touch with the person at the federal agency that has really good data on water consumption.
Cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And your next question line is open.
Yes, hi, thank you. Great job, Andy. I really appreciate all the information that you provided. Quick question in regards to future data. Now, I know that you shared information about the statistics and the data collected for 2017. However, in the now, the real-time 2020, is there any algorithm that you use to project or forecast data for this time? I know that actual data will be, presented at a later time, but is there an algorithm to use as of right now to project statistical data for this time?
So it's a great question. When we were talking at the very beginning of the presentation about all of the different surveys that we conduct at the Census Bureau, I mentioned that we do 58 different business surveys, and those include monthly and quarterly surveys and annual programs. So what users often do is they use the Economic Census to look at data at this much more detailed industry and geographic basis, albeit old data. The data is from 2017 that we're publishing right now for calendar year 2017. But then what they do is they then use our annual, our quarterly, and our monthly data to see what has happened in that industry since the 2017 Economic Census data. So we would have, for example, monthly data on retail sales through February, or January, I guess, no, February of 2020, data would be available. Unfortunately, though, those data, because they are so timely, are only available at the national level. So what users often do, and I can't specifically encourage you all to do that, but I know people do this, is they take the national level data, the current national level data, and they then estimate what that number would be at the state and the metro and the county level based upon the distribution that was published in the Economic Census. So they basically assume that the growth that has occurred between 2017 Economic Census and the 2020 monthly data has been uniform across the country, and then apply those same distributions across. Now, we don't do that at the Census Bureau. We don't even recommend specifically people do that because, again, that assumption that growth is uniform across the nation may not be true. It may be true in some industries, maybe not in others, but that's sort of the best that we can do, is direct you to the more current data that we have, and then say, you're going to have to make some leaps of faith if you want to try to estimate what that distribution would be at the local area.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And currently we have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. Well, again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. Apologies for running a few minutes late. Try to keep our webinars to 1 hour. I would remind you all again that we have another webinar scheduled for Thursday talking about the transportation and warehousing sector, where we'll take a deeper dive into data that we've released for that sector. It's a really interesting one, so I would encourage you all to come back and check out that webinar. And then also check out our webinars page for the other webinars that we're doing as part of this sector for the rest of the nation. So thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy days, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. This ends today's conference.